The debate around the burqa or its variants is neither new nor confined to India. Almost every multi-religious society has had to deal with it at some point or another. For a topic that has been and still continues to remain contested everywhere from Sweden to Syria, it is unfortunate that awareness and understanding among people is very limited. The advocates of hijab ban or burqa ban are outraged at liberals and feminists defending what they see as an overt symbol of female oppression. And those arguing against such bans point to religious prejudice instead of women emancipation driving such demands. In the cantankerous public discourse, the voices of actual burqa-clad women remain as concealed as their faces. For one side, they are socially conditioned victims of centuries-old barbaric custom who need to be rescued by the state. For the other side, they are women who confidently exercise their agency in choosing how they dress, and any state intervention would be the real oppression. Interestingly, everyone claims to be on the side of secularism. Those calling for bans do so in the spirit of equality and uniformity across all religions. And those pushing back do so for the sake of keeping public spaces inclusive of all religions. From Switzerland to Sri Lanka, public pressure, domestic politics, and constitutional constraints unique to each country have resulted in them taking very different paths on the question of the Islamic veil. Have any lessons been learned? Is it possible to examine the place of the Islamic veil in a modern secular democracy without the overpowering rhetoric and political undercurrents that almost always accompany it? This session is our attempt at just that. Welcome to Argumentative Indians. I'm Yajur Arora, and I'm honored to be here with Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at Stockholm University. He's the author of several acclaimed books with a special focus on the politics of South Asia, discussed in the context of regional and international relations. Before we start, please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. For information on more such sessions, head over to our website, argumentativeindians.com. So, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. I look forward to our discussion. This is a very central subject around which controversy has erupted. So I think we need to discuss it as deeply as possible within the time limit that you have.
So usually this debate focuses on whether or not wearing a veil is integral to Islam. And by disallowing someone from wearing it, will the state be taking away their constitutional right to freely practice their religion? To begin with, could you please shed some light on the role of the veil in Islam? Are face head coverings mandatory for observant women?
Now, just regarding, let me say that the position of Muslim scholars historically has been that anything which is explicitly laid down in the Quran as a duty or as a law is mandatory. But what we know is that in actual practice, there have been digressions from many of these values and norms laid out in the Quran. Like, for example, the question of at what age a girl should be married off, things like this. Conventionally, traditionally, once a woman is 9 years old, she is of marriageable age, she has reached puberty. But the rule now is that almost everywhere they have taken away this 9-year thing. And in Iran, it is 13 years. In, I think, Pakistan, it is 18 years. And in many other parts of the world, it's 18, 20, 21, the age limit which has been fixed. Okay. So here is an example of people believing in one thing and in behavioral terms, in what they do, that they are very different from such prescribed principles allegedly laid down in the Quran. When it comes to this veiling and hijab and all, let me read out the verse of the Quran so that we know what we are discussing directly about. So it is chapter 24 of the Quran, and the verses are 30, 31. And the Quran says, tell the believing men to lower their gaze and be modest. That is purer for them. Lo, Allah is aware of what they do. And tell the believing women to lower their gaze and be modest, and to display of their adornment only that which is apparent, and to draw their veils over their bosoms, and not to reveal their adornment save to their husbands or fathers, or husbands' fathers, or their sons, or their husbands' sons, or their brothers, or their brothers' sons or sisters' sons, or their women, or their slaves, or male attendants who lack vigor. Male attendants who lack vigor could be two things: either that they are eunuchs, or they are so old that they are not sexually any longer a threat, okay? Or children who know not of women's nakedness. Now, the interpretation has been that it is the bosom. I mean, within the Islamic argument, people who argue like this is when the Quran says that they should cover their bosom, it's this part of the body, okay? And not the head and the face. Others, yeah. And others would argue that no, since it's a question of modesty, what is more enticing than to look at the face of a woman? So then everything should be covered. And these two interpretations, I think, have coexisted. But the fact is that even before Islam emerged in the Middle East, the higher civilizations in the Middle East, like the Byzantine and the Sassanid Iranians, they had their own class sort of society where the upper classes would have their own harem, their choice women kept there for their own pleasure. And they were not for public gaze. So I think at a very early stage, when the Islamic expansions took place, the rule was that when you defeated a tribe, its men were taken slaves and they had to pay a ransom to be free, or they were sold as slaves or granted as a slave to the warriors. And the women became part of your chattel property, and they were assigned to different warriors. So thereafter, at what point they started imitating the practices of the higher civilization, because the Arabs were a very rudimentary, primitive people with a lot of wealth coming in the first 100 years of Islam. The conquest they attained was greater than what the Roman Empire did in 7 centuries. So a lot of wealth, Iranian, Persian, from the Middle East, from Central Asia, from North Africa, all poured into the Islamic treasury, And part of the treasury was gold, silver, as well as the men and women caught during the wars who had to be distributed. And so I think the harem became a value system for the upper classes. Servants of all sorts went around doing whatever task was given to them. Older men and women, were less under compulsion to observe this, but segregation of men and women came about, I think, at a very early time of Islam. Let's say within the first 40, 50 years, this had been established that men and women would belong to two different sections of society, and they will not interact. So if you look at the background, the tradition, the practice is of not only veiling and the rest, but men and women never meeting at any point. Okay. But then comes the European interventions and the idea of education. And you find Muslim societies also learning, about the new forms of knowledge. College, schools were opened. And when I was growing up in Lahore, two types of students you could find. Very few were wearing this burqa. Most of them were shalwar kameez and a dupatta. A few would have it on the head. Most would have it just around the bosom. So this is the background. Another thing which I think before you ask another question is how to ever make sense of what the Quran says and what should be done to interpret it. There are two scholars of Islam whose positions are diametrically opposed to one another. One is Imam Ghazali. When he was talking about how much reason we can use and how much should we rely on what is revealed in the Quran, his argument was that since the Quran is the word of God, its inerrancy, that it cannot be in error, is guaranteed. Therefore, whatever the Quran says explicitly has to be followed. The opposite position was of Ibn Rushd, who argued that when you see a conflict between what the Quran apparently is saying and what the philosophers are arguing, then interpret the Quran metaphorically and follow the philosophers, which is rely on reason. Unfortunately, Ibn Rushd's teachings never became mainstream. It's Imam Ghazali's idea that whenever the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet, his sayings and his doings are invoked, then you have to blindly follow them. So that's the background. If you now look at this verse that I have narrated to you, it's not, at no point does it say that you cover your face or your head. If at all the clothing has to cover anything, it's the bosom, this front part. But some would say that since Muslims were told to lower their gaze, it also includes the instruction to women to cover their faces. Who will ever resolve this? We don't know. So this is how the controversy is framed, how to interpret the Quran and where is your freedom to decide for yourself. Regarding your second question, can a state legislate and restrict the dress societies can use? Of course they do. There is a question of modesty. I can't, or no man and woman can just walk in naked anywhere. So some sort of idea of what is proper dress is, taken for granted, that you will adhere to those norms which people think are necessary to maintain peace, law and order, and to maintain the dignity of society. Okay? But if the state then is entitled to lay down the rules, it can legislate against the hijab or the veil, and there are countries which have done it. I've noted down some of those where there is explicit law that veiling, at least, complete covering of the face, is not allowed. It's unlawful to do it. Hijab, this thing, just this headgear, which has, it's a fashion which developed when Muslims settled in Western Europe. Because there was no hijab that I know of. There was shalwar kurta, shalwar and shirt and a dupatta, and or some traditional people would wear the burqa, two types of burqa, the black one and the white one, like a shuttlecock. So now the question is, can a democratic society, in the best interest of the liberation of people from all forms of oppression, legislate in favor of banning the veil? Well, we have the precedents. Turkey did it. Ataturk banned the veil completely. The hijab has come back as a midway between veiling and some sort of indication that you are a Muslim by wearing the hijab. So that's the context in which this thing has emerged.
Thank you. I found it very interesting that you said that back in the day in Lahore, it wasn't very common to see women clad in burqa. Most women would just wear salwar kameez. And that seems to be an observation for many other parts in South Asia. In Kashmir, it was a lot less common, for example, to see burqa-clad women, and other parts of India too. Is there the fact that there is so much of focus on this? Do you think that is making more people gravitate towards that? It's drawing more attention that others do not want you to do it because it's Islamic. So more people to tell themselves that, yes, I am pious. They are more likely to do it now. Do you think it's backfiring, the emphasis on what we see as, or what opponents see as oppressive practices? There has been a lot of focus, but is it pushing people more towards those practices?
Well, in some cases, maybe yes. But let me tell you my own experience. I was teaching in Lahore from 2015 to 2019 at Government College University, an MPhil class for human rights. And I had girl students coming who, when they left home, would wear a complete burqa. But as soon as they were on the campus, they took it off. And when I asked them, why should this be so? They said, sir, you have no idea, in the mohalla that we live in, if we walk, the way we want to without a burqa, we will be, harassed, intimidated by all the men, by all the catcalls and the whistles and so on. So, but when we come to the campus, we feel safe and we take it off. I'll give you the example from France. When this veiling hijab question came up, the French did some research and showed that whereas the girls do want to take it off, it's the elder brother who sits with the local priest and the young men who is the most concerned about the dignity of the family and the honor of the family. And he's the most conservative, wanting his sister to wear the hijab, Not so much the parents. The parents are workers who would reconcile to the girl making her own decision. So it's partly this young men who feel threatened when their sister is there to look at. So what the French did was, they said that while you are going to school, you can't wear a veil or burqa, hijab, but once you are 18, then it is your free choice and you can do it. So that's the compromise they achieved in France.
So going back to that example, right, like where women who live in these subculture, sub-societies where they are harassed for not wearing or they feel intimidated, when there is an external, like the majoritarian society imposing a ban that you can't wear, do you see the possibility that it could actually result in them leaving the public space entirely and confining themselves to their subcultures? So like in some cases, for example, even in France, a lot of women then stopped going to the school, although I mean it's illegal there and they force you to. But that is something that they, if the public spaces become inhospitable, that instead of changing their own practices, they might cling more to their practices and leave the public spaces altogether. So then instead of having more emancipated women, we might end up marginalizing them even further.
That sort of thing we can fear all the time, because this is what I gave you the example of my students who, when they left the mohalla, for them freedom was to have the burqa on to safely come to the campus. But once on the campus, they took it off. So really, I think they want to be free, but the burqa is their safety as well within their conservative societies, you know. So in one sense, if you very strictly forbid, you know, conservative Muslims from their women wearing the hijab or veil, you may end up removing them from the public space. So where is the balance is very difficult to establish. I think it's a very sensitive issue, but this is how I've seen my students handle this. In their own localities, they would wear the burqa because it makes them safe vis-a-vis the very aggressive milieu in which they grow up. But the campuses are places where they feel liberated and free, and then they take it off.
So the freedom itself is an interesting term, right? I think freedom is usually in like being able to do whatever you want to do, not being dictated. So it's interesting because the example you gave is like when the pressure on these women is to wear the veil, they find freedom in getting rid of it. But I wonder if it works the other way around. And that's what we are seeing, like in the recent controversy in India, the fact that the government comes out with a law that you can't wear it resulted in so many more women suddenly started wearing it who were not wearing it earlier. And is that also an expression of freedom, that I will do what I want to do?
In a way, I have to grant your argument, because the way the Muslim community in India perceives the current BJP government, it is hostile to Muslims in general. You know, this law about citizenship and CAA and all this is part of their recent experience and the resistance they gave to these laws, you know. And so maybe the Indian Muslims feel that they are being cornered through such laws. And among them, there must be resentment, a lot of fear about their future as Indian citizens. So that aspect of the problem also has to be taken into consideration. Ideally, the government should be able to carry its citizens when they are carrying out reforms. And that doesn't seem to be the case with the BJP. The Muslim community in India perceive the BJP as hostile to them as a minority community. And therefore, these attitudes that you talk about. You know, in the Shah Bano case, there was a possibility, had the law passed by the Supreme Court become operational rather than the Rajiv Gandhi, you know, government passing a bill from the parliament giving exemption to the Muslims, I think it would have set the pace already for the liberation and emancipation of women. That didn't happen. And now the government which is trying to do it has a record which at least the Muslims feel is hostile to Islam and Muslims in general. I think it's more of a psychological problem.
Yeah, actually, you pointed to something very important. This is what I wanted to ask. Can reform come from people that you see as hostile to your community, as antagonists? And if they are the ones pushing for reform, are the adherents of the religion likely to become more observant or less? because you talked about BJP in this case, which the minority probably does not feel represent them. But there are strong parallels to that in Sweden, where there was also a political debate around the topic of veil. France, Germany, in all these countries, Muslims are a minority pretty much in the same percentages as in India. So I think the similar kind of dynamics has played out. And I would like to ask, like, when the demand for reform comes not from within the community, but from outsiders, from an authority that you do not think represents your community, then is that reform likely to take place, or is it likely to kind of like push you the other way around as the force of resistance? Interestingly, I just want to bring one more example here, which just comes to my mind. When the British had tried to crush all forms of classical dance in India, Bharatanatyam, Kathak, all of that, I think they came out with a law banning all these dance forms. Looking back, a lot of scholars see that as the pivotal point when these dance forms became really popular in India. They came out of palaces and temples and were embraced by local people as a form of protest against the authoritarian rule of the British. So kind of like backfired spectacularly. And I mean, till today, I mean, these dance forms are immensely popular. So I'm just wondering, like, when we try to lead the reform from outside without having insiders on board, is it likely to more backfire and push the Muslims even more towards conservatism?
Well, it depends, what issue is at stake. Let me give a counter example. Among Hindus, for example, there was also a problem at what age can a girl be married? And Raja Ram Mohan Roy and the reformists, they favored the end to child marriages. But in 1913, when in Bombay this law was changed, then this great Indian nationalist Tilak, he came out opposing it, saying that as soon as women start having a period, they acquire sexual awareness, and not to marry them early then is to make them live in sin. But nobody listened to him because other Hindu reformers supported this law. Similarly, sati, I think, banning sati was successful. In the case of dancing, I mean, this is the first time I've heard it, and it became a form of popular resistance, very good. In one sense, then wailing and all could play such a role as well. But I would argue that the Indian government is not an alien government. It's a government of the Indian people. After all other rights the Muslims derived in India are because they are Indian citizens. All the freedoms they enjoy. So they can't really say that the BJP government is an alien government. It's a government which is hostile to them, but they have a chance to change them along with others in elections and so on. But some sort of resistance would always be there, because we cannot deny that there is an Islamic fundamentalist Islamist movement all over the world whose only goal is to alienate Muslims from mainstream societies. They do it in Western Europe. I'm sure they do it in India as well. So I would favor a reform which is inclusive and universal and applies to everyone. I've heard the argument, well, why not then make the Sikhs take off their turban? As an argument, this is unassailable. Of course, this is true. How do you deal with it? You keep on negotiating, you keep on discussing, and you try to mobilize Muslim opinion in favor of banning the veiling at least. Maybe hijab can be allowed as a midway solution, Hijab, okay, but not burqa and the rest. can't hear.
It's interesting. I think earlier at some point you said hijab kind of ended up in Turkey as a midway solution just to indicate you're Muslim, right? So it's an identifier. When you look at these political movements from Sweden to India, where the majority wants to eliminate these symbols which are loudly telling the world that I'm a Muslim, is it because they want to remove that identity, what they see as the otherness, from their public spaces? Is that itself the problem, that there is a government which is openly announcing that I am part of this society, this polity, and I am Muslim? That overt identity, is that itself the problem for the majority which is rooting for it to be removed from the public space? Does it bother them?
Well, let me say like this, that most Western European Union countries have not gone out to ban either the veil or the hijab. A few have done. Belgium, I think, is there. France is another example. In Sweden, there has been a debate because it was left to the headmaster to decide whether in a school a student can wear the complete veil or not. So it was applied in different ways in Sweden. But the debate is now on that this is simply an indication of women being chattel, belonging to someone else. And to emancipate them, such a dress should be banned. So there are these arguments going around. But the governments are very cautious. They still leave it to the individual to make a free choice. But there are Islamists who provoke people. I've seen girls about 6-7 years with a burqa, and so that's a provocation. So there's a political campaign going on as well.
I mean, it's bad for those girls who are forced against their will or conditioned into an early stage. But why is it a provocation for others? Is the provocation because they don't want to see women being put into those situations? Or is it a provocation that the Islamics are showing them a finger or something? Why is it a provocation for others? For example, in India, where this started was that they used a rule which was basically that you cannot wear something which disturbs the public peace. My question is like, why is somebody wearing that is an offense to another person or disturbs public peace?
I agree with you. I mean, if people are not bothered by somebody wearing a peculiar dress, then there is no problem. But if in the society this has become an issue, then the government needs to have some policy on it. That's the whole problem, I'm sure the Hindu right wing has done a lot to provoke Muslims into corner them in this situation. And the BJP government has played a role as well. We know that for a fact. In such a situation, I've heard Priyanka Gandhi and many other enlightened people saying it's the freedom of the woman to decide what dress to wear and what dress not to wear. And I have to agree with that as well. But ultimately, the best reform is one in which you can carry the people with yourself. So maybe the BJP's way of doing it has not been well received by the Muslims. Secondly, among the Muslims, there is the ulama and the conservatives who want to retain a complete monopoly hold over their societies. So they would resist it for those reasons. They don't want India to intervene in the lives of what they think is their constituency, and which is the Muslims of India. So how to undo that hold of this insulation of the Muslims is another question.
Yeah, actually, and on that question, I've seen two major, very different models, right? There is one France and the other United Kingdom. Both of them are liberal, secular democracy, something India espouses to be. France takes a stance that complete separation of state and religion, uniformity for everybody. Nobody is allowed to wear hijab or or the Catholic cross or anything to schools. Complete,
Yeah.
everybody's the same. So that's one path. And then the other path is United Kingdom, which says we are a multicultural society, we are inclusive of everybody, and everybody is to large extent allowed to express their own religious identities in their own way. So both models have been going on. And I wonder, like, if you have any view on which one has led to more assimilation versus more alienation among the minority community.
Well, I think in both societies, the Muslims are alienated because their alienation followed after the Iranian Revolution came, and then the Saudis who felt threatened. Both started financing mosques in Western Europe, where the message was not to integrate with the local populations. So in Britain, there is no integration of the Muslims into British society. I mean, they live in their own enclaves, in their own communities, the same way as in France, I don't find British Muslims integrated into British society in any meaningful sense at all. And the same can be said about France. There are educated French Muslims who are in the films, who are in the parliament. What about them? I think I personally am in favor of the French model, I think, if you ask my opinion. But some people think that the British approach is more mature because it leaves it to the individual voluntarily to integrate. But integration in British society is as limited as it is in France because of Islamism being a global ideology which teaches Muslims to keep themselves away from all westernization. You live there, you have families, but you are not part of these societies. These are not societies based on the Sharia and Islam. So Muslim isolation has to be broken somehow. Let me say one thing, that the British have used Islam, and the Anglo-Saxons have used Islam against secularism during the Cold War. After all, the Afghan jihad and all was carried out by the Americans with the advice of old British hands, Afghan hands, who told them what to do. So Islamic conservatism that we are living with its extremism and forms of terrorism at times, is actually something which during the Cold War was cultivated by the British and the Americans to counter nationalist movements in the Arab world and secular trends in the Muslim world and against the Soviet Union. Now, of course, it's a different world. But once you create a consciousness that you are a community apart from others and you are the best in the world, that sort of feeling is shared by Muslims, then the idea is not to mix with the rest. Assimilation is out of the question for them. Even integration, integration is that your identity is accepted, but you go around, taking part in the economy and in the public space, but as individuals, belonging to a specific community, which is not the same as the host societies. Assimilation is when you try to be French or you try to be British. Some people succeed, that is done voluntarily, yeah.
But the Muslim isolation, you said Muslim isolation has to be broken somehow.
Yeah.
Do you think it can be broken by a powerful state which sees them as an alien, or they have to produce their own Raja Ram Mohan Roys from within their community to break it?
Well, they did. One was Ataturk. And if you go to Turkey, even after Erdogan's you, you know, systematic attempts to undermine Ataturk, the same as Modi does against Nehruvian India. You know, that's the parallel. Still, uh, Turkish women are westernized, are freer than anywhere else in the Muslim world. So that once you emancipate women, I think they do not want to go back to the old system. My wife is Turkish, and when I went there in the 80s, I remember old women, when we mentioned Ataturk, they would pay respect by touching like this, saying that he liberated us. So this is the truth. Liberation of women came with Ataturk. Even in Pakistan, as I was telling you, the trend was towards more women going to school and college and just wearing shalwar and kurta. Of course, there were others, traditional lower middle class women who continued to wear the burqa, but those who went to college and university, more and more took them off. Until this Afghan jihad came, and the ulama, who had no status in Pakistani society, they were elevated to, an alternative power structure in Pakistan. They were trained to kill, they were armed, and now they are a threat to any idea of reform, progress. Just look at Pakistan and its laws. So the damage has been done by the British American decision to use Islam against secularism and progressive nationalism, which was called Arab nationalism.
Mhm.
That's the background.
No, that's very interesting. The only thing I would bring is like Turkey, though, however, it was at least a religiously largely homogenous society. I don't want to say homogenous because they obviously had the Armenians and other Christians and others, but largely it was homogenous. So like Ataturk was not seen as an enemy. And you pointed out correctly that in India, or in case of France, Sweden, Macron would not be seen as a reformer of the religion. So it would be difficult for him to get that level of acceptability in the Muslim community, nor can Modi get, nor can Boris Johnson can hope to ever get that. So that is definitely a huge challenge, that you come across as hostile when you're trying to push for any change. But also, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting to get this view from outside. I think you did point out correctly that both approaches have been experienced in UK's inclusive approach. We don't really see much integration that has been achieved with that way, or the French approach of uniformity. And again, the results don't seem to have shown. And you recommend uniformity. I think whichever way we go, what's important is to remain entirely unbiased across all religions. I think that
that is what I was trying to tell you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's there. Otherwise, there is no way to earn credibility. And without getting into whatever might be the more true motivations of the current push for change in India, whether it is driven by religious prejudice as something, or driven by urgency to emancipate women, or for out of feminist concerns, I do think that the problem is the lack of moral credibility of the regime, right? You don't really have the moral credibility to be challenging if you have in the past attacked a religion, you have come across as biased. Perhaps if somebody like Nehru or somebody else in our history had tried to seek similar reforms, they may have been much more acceptability. But we are where we are now, and
I think that's a very wise statement you made. Had Nehru at that moment, when he reformed the Hindu personal law, also gone in for the Muslim personal law, and things had changed, and or in the Shah Bano case, as late as that, if the law had been passed, the reform process would be people would be able to see the results of it. Let me tell you one thing. It's a good example to learn from. General Ayub Khan, he changed the laws regarding Muslim family law. The rights of women were granted according to the Quran, one half of a son. Previously, it was customary law. Women were not given any share in property. Okay. Second, if you divorce your wife, it had to be registered with the local council. And then if you were to marry another, or if you retained your wife, she had to sign that she is allowing you to marry another woman. That also had to be registered with the local council. And the local council consisted of people who had been elected, for local self-government. So this thing became public. We can say that the right to divorce was not taken away. It was restricted. It had to be made public. And even after General Zia, who was a thoroughbred Islamist, took over, he didn't change this law, because all these laws favor the rights of women in Pakistan. Although when these laws were introduced by Ayub Khan, I was then about 11, 10 years old. People were marching, agitating the ulama that this is against Islam. He had introduced 16 years age limit, for girls to marry. Below that would be a criminal offense. And they said in Islam, there is no age limit. You can marry a girl of any age. But to this day, that law has stayed on. What I'm trying to say is that in India, bringing the Muslims into the mainstream is most important. How you do it, how you make it credible for the Muslims is a different thing. I think I'll give you some examples. After the this Babri Masjid thing was granted to the Hindus, there was no Muslim agitation, there was maybe resentment. Then the BJP did away with Article 370 and integrated Kashmir into the Indian mainstream. And I remember the head of the Jamiyat-e-Ulama Hind, Maulana Mahmood Madani, saying that Kashmir is an atu tongue of India. So here also the BJP was able to carry the Muslims with them. Maybe they didn't like it, but they supported it. Instead of going up for these discriminatory laws that people who come from so country, who's a non-Muslim only can apply for asylum, and then everybody has to show that their parents had lived in India, and this was openly discriminatory against the Muslims. Had they instead, after these two changes, gone in for the uniform civil code, I'm sure the Muslims would have agreed to that, because the momentum was with the BJP. They had been given a mandate for that. It is they who spoiled the whole thing by introducing this CAA and that's discriminatory. And then thereafter comes all these different changes. So I mean, you and I seem to agree on this, that the reformer must have some credibility with the people that he's trying to carry with him, and that the BJP doesn't have.
Yeah, and I would finally, and I would think I'm not in a position, so I can't really talk how a woman feels. But if I were to try to place myself in that position, I would think that being told to wear a veil, I would find it very offensive. I would feel angry and furious if I was told to do that, and oppressed and offended. But at the same time, I would feel equally oppressed and offended if I'm wearing something and somebody asked me to take it off forcefully. either ways, the use of force would end up offending me and alienate me towards the authority that is forcing me. So I think we need to, if we need to get to our goals through consensus building, through education, through consensus building, and through inclusiveness, as you just said.
Absolutely. But remember, women are forced to do things also by their families and their surroundings. That part of the story, I think I wanted to highlight, that the French research showed that most of these girls were very happy in taking away, hijab and all. This had been forced upon them by their families. And that is why it has succeeded now. The French made the law, and the law is adhered to now. In India, we need another government maybe, but such an emancipation, I think, should come about at some point. In terms of competitiveness, in order to compete in the market and so on, for women to find jobs, it is important that they enjoy the same rights and freedoms as others do. But right now, I have to agree with you that all forms of compulsion can be perceived as acts of oppression if you yourself are not happy with it. That's correct.
Well, I think that's a lovely note to end the conversation with. I'd like to thanks a lot to you, sir, for joining us and for shedding light on this matter, and also for bringing your perspective, which is informed not just by the experiences in South Asia, but also by experiences in Europe. So thanks a lot for the conversation today. We hope to have you with us again in future. And everyone who's watching, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more interesting and engaging and informative sessions. Namaskar.